Picture this. You're a Roman soldier marching through a dense German forest in 9 AD. Birds are chirping. The trail looks clear. And then, without warning, the ground just isn't there anymore. 9 feet of empty air later, you're impaled on a sharpened stake, and your entire legion just walked into one of the deadliest ambushes in human history. That's the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. And it's just one example of something humans have been ridiculously good at since the Stone Age, building traps to kill each other. Today we're digging into how ancient human traps actually worked. Not animal traps, though. We'll touch on those too, since a lot of these designs started out as ways to catch dinner before someone realized, this would also work great on my enemies. We're talking pits, spikes, deadfalls, snares, and some nightmarish engineering that proves our ancestors did not mess around when it came to defending their turf. Stick around because by the end of this, you're going to look at every hole in the ground a little differently. Let's start with the simplest, oldest, and honestly most terrifying trap in human history, the pit trap. The concept is stupidly simple. You dig a hole, you cover it up, and gravity does the rest. But the execution is where things get clever, and honestly a little diabolical. Early pit traps used for hunting date back tens of thousands of years. Archaeologists have found evidence of pit traps used to catch mammoths in what's now Germany, dating back around 300,000 years, which honestly is older than our own species in some classifications. These weren't just holes either. Hunters figured out that if you angle the walls of the pit inward, like an upside-down cone, an animal that falls in can't climb back out. Its own weight and the slick, angled walls work against it. Add some sharpened stakes at the bottom, and you've just built a device that does the hunting for you while you're off doing literally anything else. Now here's where it gets interesting. Once humans figured out this worked great on deer and mammoths, it didn't take long to realize it worked exactly the same way on people. Southeast Asian tribes, particularly in Vietnam, refined pit traps into an art form that would later become horrifyingly relevant during the Vietnam War, but the roots go back centuries earlier. These pits were often shaped to angle the stakes so a person falling in wouldn't just get impaled going down, they'd get impaled coming back up if they tried to climb out. Some were even designed with a slight tilt so that a struggling victim's movements would drive the stakes in deeper. That's not an accident. That's someone sitting there thinking really hard about human anatomy and worst-case scenarios. And the camouflage on these things was next level. We're talking thin lattices of woven bamboo or branches covered in leaf litter, dirt, moss, sometimes even living plants transplanted on top so the ground looked completely undisturbed. Some trap builders would deliberately create a false trail, a path that looked more walkable, more traveled, practically inviting you to step exactly where they wanted you to step. It's basically the ancient version of a phishing email, except instead of stealing your bank details, it's stealing your ability to walk. Let's talk materials for a second, because this is where a lot of people get the wrong idea. You might picture ancient traps using metal spikes, but for most of human history before widespread metalworking, these were made of fire-hardened wood. And fire-hardened wood is nastier than it sounds. You take a sharpened wooden stake, you char the tip in a fire, and that heat process actually hardens the wood fibers, making the point more rigid and resistant to snapping. It's basically DIY tempering. Some cultures went a step further and coated the tips in toxins, animal waste, or decaying material specifically to cause infection if the wound itself didn't finish the job, because apparently just falling onto spikes wasn't quite mean enough. Now let's move from things that go down into things that come at you sideways, because deadfall traps are a whole different flavor of ancient engineering, and one that's honestly kind of elegant in a please don't be near this when it triggers kind of way. A deadfall trap uses a heavy object, usually a large log or a stack of rocks, suspended or balanced above a trigger point. When the trigger is disturbed, the whole thing comes crashing down. The classic version most people picture is the figure 4 trigger, a simple 3-stick mechanism that holds a heavy weight in a precarious balance. Touch the bait stick, and the entire structure collapses. This design is so effective and so simple that survivalists still teach it today, thousands of years after it was first figured out. For hunting, deadfalls were usually sized for small game, crushing rather than impaling. But when scaled up for defensive purposes, things got significantly more serious. Some hill fort communities in ancient Britain and across parts of Europe built massive deadfall systems along approach paths, essentially rigging entire sections of a hillside so that an advancing force could trigger a landslide of logs, rocks, or both. Imagine climbing up a hill to attack a fortified settlement, and instead of meeting warriors at the top, the hill itself decides to fight back. This is actually a good moment to point out something that a lot of people miss about ancient defensive traps. They weren't always meant to kill outright. A lot of the time, the goal was to slow down, injure, and demoralize. A twisted ankle in the middle of a coordinated night raid is just as effective as a fatal wound because now that person can't run, can't fight properly, and needs help from their allies, which pulls more people out of the fight. Ancient trap designers understood something modern military strategists still rely on. Injuring an enemy costs the enemy more resources than killing them because now they have to carry that person, treat that person, and worry about that person. Okay, let's talk about something you've definitely heard of even if you didn't know the name: caltrops. These things are brutally simple. 4 spikes arranged so that no matter how you throw it on the ground, one spike always points straight up. Scatter a bunch of these across a path, and you've created an instant deterrent against cavalry, foot soldiers, or basically anyone without shoes rated for stepping on medieval Lego bricks made of pure malice. Caltrops have a documented history going back to at least Roman times, where they were called tribuli, and they were devastatingly effective against cavalry charges. A horse stepping on one of these isn't just injured, it's often taken completely out of the fight, and a wounded, panicking horse in the middle of a charge causes chaos far beyond just that one animal. Roman military writers actually recommended scattering caltrops specifically in front of infantry lines when facing cavalry-heavy enemies, because it turned open ground into a minefield without needing any explosives at all. The Japanese had their own version, called makibishi, sometimes made from dried spiky seed pods before craftsmen started forging metal versions. Ninjas, and yes, we're using that word because it's accurate here, would scatter these behind them while retreating, turning a chase into an agonizing game of where do I put my foot for anyone following. It's honestly one of the more low-effort, high-reward inventions in the history of warfare. You don't need to build anything elaborate. You just need a pointy object that's mathematically guaranteed to always face upward, and gravity handles the rest. Now let's step into snare traps, because these are fascinating for a completely different reason. Snares are all about tension and release, and the physics behind them are honestly kind of beautiful if you ignore what they're actually doing to a living creature. A basic snare uses a noose, usually made of plant fiber, sinew, or later rope, connected to a bent sapling or another tensioned mechanism. When triggered, that stored energy releases suddenly, yanking the noose tight, and often lifting whatever's caught right off the ground. For hunting small game, this was a staple technique across basically every continent because it required minimal materials and could be left unattended for hours or days. When adapted for use against people, snare-based traps got creative in ways that honestly deserve some grudging respect. Some designs used a triggered noose around ankle height along a trail, connected to a bent tree that would snap upward when triggered, yanking a person's leg into the air and leaving them suspended upside down, immobilized, and completely vulnerable. Others incorporated sharpened stakes positioned right where a suspended, flailing victim's body would swing. So, not only are you now hanging by one leg, you're also swinging directly into a wall of spikes. It's diabolical design, and it required a real understanding of rope tension, wood elasticity, and human movement patterns to pull off correctly. Here's a fun little detail that a lot of people don't know. The tension mechanisms in these traps had to account for the fact that trees behave differently depending on species, moisture content, and even the time of year. A sapling bent in dry summer conditions stores and releases energy differently than the same sapling bent during a wet season. Skilled trap builders essentially had to be part engineer, part botanist, constantly adjusting their designs based on the specific environment they were working in. This wasn't guesswork passed down as folklore, it was empirical knowledge refined generation after generation, tested against real consequences. Get it wrong, and the trap either doesn't trigger or it triggers too early and gives away the entire ambush. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about something bigger than individual traps. Entire landscapes engineered as traps. Because some ancient societies didn't just plant a few pits along a trail, they redesigned entire approaches to their settlements to be lethal. Iron Age hill forts across Britain are a great example. Many of these sites feature multiple concentric ditches and banks, and archaeologists have found evidence that some ditches contained rows of sharpened stakes, essentially turning the entire perimeter into a moat of pain. An attacking force couldn't just charge the walls, walls, they had to navigate a maze of ditches, each one potentially hiding spikes, all while defenders on the elevated banks rained down projectiles from above. The terrain itself became a weapon, and the traps were integrated into the natural landscape so thoroughly that attackers often couldn't tell safe ground from lethal ground until it was too late. This same philosophy shows up at the Siege of Alesia in 52 BC, one of the most famous examples in ancient military history. Julius Caesar's forces besieging the Gallic leader Vercingetorix while simultaneously needing to defend against a massive relief army arriving from outside, built an absolutely staggering system of fortifications. Among them were devices the Romans called lilia, named because the pattern reportedly resembled lily flowers. These were camouflaged pits containing sharpened stakes, arranged in checkerboard patterns across open ground, specifically designed to disable cavalry and infantry attempting to cross that space to reach the Roman walls. Caesar's own writings describe these fields of concealed pits as a critical part of the defensive strategy because they forced attackers to slow down and pick their way across ground that looked completely normal but absolutely was not. What's remarkable here is the scale. We're not talking about one or two traps hidden along a path. We're talking about fields of them systematically placed, camouflaged, and integrated into a broader defensive strategy that also included obstacles like sharpened branches called stimuli, buried with just the tips exposed, essentially an ancient version of underground caltrops. The Romans treated trap engineering as a genuine military discipline, not an afterthought. Let's talk about something that connects almost every trap we've discussed so far, and it's the concept of the compound trap, meaning a trap that combines multiple hazards into a single system so that avoiding one danger puts you directly into another. A classic example, documented in various tribal warfare traditions across Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, involves a visible, obvious hazard, something that looks dangerous enough that a person will instinctively try to step around it. Except stepping around it leads directly into a concealed pit or triggers a snare. The visible danger isn't the trap, it's the bait that directs you into the actual trap. This kind of layered psychological engineering shows a sophisticated understanding of human instinct. People see an obvious threat and react by avoiding it, and trap builders exploited that predictable reaction ruthlessly. Some Vietnamese trap systems from earlier tribal conflicts, well before their more famous use in the 20th century, used a design where a shallow, obviously disturbed patch of ground would draw attention and caution, while the real danger was a spring-loaded spike trap positioned along the natural path someone would take to avoid the obvious patch. It's a trap that manipulates decision-making itself, not just physical movement. That's an advanced level of design thinking for something built entirely out of wood, rope, and dirt. Now, let's shift gears and talk about defensive architecture, because castles and fortified structures across medieval history incorporated traps directly into their construction, and some of these are honestly ingenious. Murder holes, technically called meurtrières, were openings built into the ceilings of gatehouse passages. If an enemy force managed to breach the outer gate, they'd find themselves funneled through a narrow corridor, completely exposed to defenders positioned above who could drop rocks, pour boiling liquids, or fire arrows straight down through these openings. The narrow corridor itself was the trap. It looked like a way in. It was actually a kill box. Portcullises worked alongside this design beautifully. A heavy iron or wood grate that could be dropped rapidly to seal off a passage, sometimes used specifically to trap an advancing force between two portcullises, one in front and one behind, essentially locking enemies into the murder hole corridor with nowhere to run. This combination turned the entryway of a castle, which you'd think would be the most straightforward part of the structure, into one of its deadliest features. Moats get a lot of casual jokes made about them, but they were effective defensive traps in their own right. Beyond just being a water obstacle, many moats had angled or stepped bottoms, sometimes lined with sharpened stakes hidden beneath the waterline. An attacker attempting to wade or swim across wouldn't see the danger until they were already in the water, and by then retreating was just as dangerous as continuing forward. Some fortifications also used what's sometimes called a wolf pit, a deep pit dug just outside the walls, camouflaged with branches and turf, specifically positioned where an attacking force would need to approach to use siege equipment or ladders. Historical records from various medieval European conflicts describe these being used to disable siege towers and battering rams by causing the massive wooden structures to tip or collapse when their wheels hit unstable, trap-laden ground. Let's take a moment to talk about something a little different. Traps used in more personal, smaller-scale contexts, because not every ancient trap was about warfare. Plenty were about protecting individual homes, food stores, or valuable resources from thieves. In parts of ancient China, historical texts describe the use of crossbow traps, mechanisms where a taut crossbow was rigged with a tripwire across a doorway or passage, set to fire automatically if triggered. Perhaps the most famous example associated with this technology is the legendary tomb of Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, where historical accounts describe automatically triggering crossbows installed throughout the tomb complex, specifically to kill any grave robbers who made it past the outer defenses. Whether every detail of that account is completely accurate is debated among historians, but the underlying technology, automatic tripwire-triggered projectile weapons, is well documented in other contexts and absolutely was within the technological capability of the era. This is honestly one of the wildest parts of ancient trap engineering. The idea of a mechanism that fires itself, with no person needed to operate it, using nothing but tension, a trigger mechanism, and basic mechanical principles that were understood over 2,000 years ago. No electricity, no gunpowder in the earliest versions, just rope, wood, and an impressive grasp of physics. Let's bring things back to something a little more grounded, literally, and talk about how ancient trap builders dealt with one of the biggest challenges in this entire field: making a trap that looks like nothing at all. Camouflage wasn't just about tossing some leaves on top of a hole. Skilled trap builders studied the specific environment they were working in obsessively. They'd note exactly how leaf litter naturally settled in that area, what the undisturbed ground actually looked like at different times of day with different lighting, and how animals or people naturally walked through that specific terrain. A trap built with generic camouflage in the wrong environment stands out immediately to anyone paying attention. A trap built with camouflage matched precisely to its surroundings can be invisible even to someone actively searching for it. Some trap builders would deliberately let traps sit unused for extended periods before their intended use, allowing natural regrowth, insect activity, and weathering to further disguise the disturbed ground. Others used decoy materials, positioning less critical false traps nearby that were easier to spot, so that once someone found and avoided one trap, they'd feel a false sense of security and relax their guard right before walking straight into the real one. That's not just trap building. That's genuine psychological warfare, using overconfidence itself as a weapon. And here's a detail that really shows how seriously some cultures took this craft. Trap building was often a specialized, respected skill passed down through specific families or trained specialists within a community, not something every person just knew how to do. These individuals studied terrain, human psychology, materials science before anyone called it that, and mechanical engineering, all without written manuals in a lot of cases, relying entirely on oral tradition and hands-on apprenticeship. Getting it wrong wasn't a minor mistake. A poorly built trap could fail to protect a community during an actual attack, or worse, could injure or kill the wrong person entirely. Let's talk briefly about something a lot of people don't consider: how communities protected themselves from their own traps. If you're defending a settlement with a network of concealed pits, snares, and spike fields, you absolutely need a way for your own people to move through that same terrain without becoming victims of your own defenses. This required detailed mental, or sometimes physically marked maps, safe paths known only to community members, often using subtle natural markers like specific rock placements, particular tree carvings, or paths that appeared to lead somewhere but were actually just decorative decoys themselves. Some historical accounts describe communities using specific walking patterns or rhythms known only to residents, essentially a physical password system where the correct sequence of steps avoided every hazard, while any other pattern of movement triggered something. Children in these communities would have been taught these safe routes from a young age, turning trap navigation into something almost like a rite of passage, a piece of essential survival knowledge as fundamental as knowing which plants were edible. Now, let's connect all of this to something that might surprise you: the direct lineage between these ancient techniques and trap systems used in far more recent conflicts. The punji stake traps used during the Vietnam War in the 20th century weren't some new invention born out of that specific conflict. They were a direct continuation of techniques with roots going back centuries, refined and adapted, but fundamentally built on the same principles of concealment, angled stakes, and psychological pressure that we've been talking about this entire time. Understanding the ancient version genuinely helps make sense of why these later systems were so effective and so feared, because they weren't improvised. They were the product of an incredibly long, continuous tradition of trap engineering knowledge. This is honestly one of the more humbling things about studying ancient traps. We tend to think of old technology as primitive, as something we've completely surpassed, but the fundamental principles behind these traps, exploiting gravity, tension, camouflage, terrain, and human psychology, are principles that still work exactly the same way today because physics and human nature haven't changed. A pit trap built 10,000 years ago works on the exact same principles as a pit trap built 100 years ago because gravity really doesn't care how much time has passed. Let's wrap things up by talking about why this matters beyond just being a fascinating bit of history. Ancient trap technology represents one of humanity's earliest forms of applied engineering, requiring an understanding of physics, materials, biology, and psychology, all developed and refined without formal scientific institutions, without written technical manuals in many cases, and without any of the tools we take for granted today. Every single trap we've talked about represents generations of trial, error, observation, and refinement passed down through communities who depended on getting these designs right for their very survival. It's easy to look at a hole in the ground with some sharpened sticks and think it's simple, and in a sense it is. But the simplicity is the genius. These were solutions engineered to work reliably, using minimal resources, exploiting fundamental physical principles that required no advanced technology to execute, just careful observation and patient craftsmanship. Our ancestors weren't just surviving. They were actively out-engineering their environment and their enemies, using nothing but wood, rope, dirt, and a genuinely impressive understanding of how bodies move and how people think. So next time you're out on a hiking trail and the ground looks just a little too clean, a little too conveniently walkable, maybe give it a second look. Probably nothing's there, almost certainly nothing's there. But history has shown us again and again that the most dangerous ground is usually the ground that looks the safest.